So today we will be discussing defending your doctoral study, whether that be the proposal or the final defense. Before we get started, I did want to tell you a little bit about Statistics Solutions. So we are a dissertation editing and consulting company. We help doctoral students all the way from topic development through to the final defense of the dissertation. So if you're someone who feels like you might benefit from those type of services, please feel free to reach out to us using the links in the chat. But we will go ahead and get started. So some general tips. Again, today I will be talking about the proposal and also the final defense. So we'll have some slides related to each of those. Generally, the proposal defense is going to be shorter than the final defense. So you should expect to present for around 20 minutes, followed by 20 to 30 minutes of questions from your committee or just general discussion around your presentation. A few general tips about your presentation. You want to be sure not to read directly off of your PowerPoint slides. You should have some additional discussion developed or some notes developed to help you really speak in depth to whatever you've already included on your slides. Also, you don't want to have your slides be too wordy, so it's best practice to just include some general key points or key phrases on the slides, and then you can expand upon those points through your discussion and through what you're going to be talking about. So your slides are really just going to be a guide for you instead of, kind of a script. So just think about adding those key things that people should take away from your proposal or your defense on the slide, and then utilize the presenter notes to really have some expanded discussion around those topics. Generally, when you start, you will want to start off by thanking your committee members and also your reviewers by name. You can do this at the beginning or you can do it at the end. So some people choose to open their presentation with a thank you, but it's totally up to you. Whatever you think is most appropriate, you can start off or you can move the slide later on in the presentation. Then once you get that out of the way, you're going to really begin talking about your presentation. So whether you are in the proposal phase or the defense phase, you're going to start off with the introduction and the background of your study. So this is when you are going to introduce the topic that you're studying and also summarize any literature or major research around that topic to really provide some context for your reader or your listeners on why you believe that your study is necessary. So here's where you're laying that groundwork. Here you should highlight any potential gaps in the literature or any areas that led you to believe that this study had merit, right? So why did you choose this topic? Why did you choose these particular methods for your study? Here in this introduction / background area is where you're really going to be identifying those reasons. Next, you're going to start describing the problem statement. So you want to directly state whatever the research problem that you've identified for your study is. So the good thing about these presentations is that you, at this point, will have pretty much written out or proposed in some type of document these concepts. So you've probably written your proposal, or if you're already defending your research, you've already very clearly identified this problem statement. So for a lot of this, you can just take the language that you've already put down on paper and move it over to slides and just kind of build the conversation around the statements and the ideas that you've already put down. So here is where you'll just remind the listeners, remind your reviewers of what that problem statement is, further bolstering the rationale for you conducting the study that you selected. Next, you're going to want to talk about the purpose statement. So this is where you're going to talk about the purpose of your study. Here, it's important to make sure that you are staying very true to the purpose that you've outlined in your in your paper. So you want to make sure that you are being very consistent and that there's no ambiguity between the documents that you've generated and then your PowerPoint. So you want to make sure you can kind of copy and paste this verbatim, and you're really just making sure that that language is the same. If you change language in your purpose statement, it may have implications for the meaning. So just try to be very consistent here so that your readers aren't leaving confused, and that your purpose from your presentation aligns with the purpose that you've already talked about in that paper. Next, you will talk about your research questions. So depending on your study, these research questions can be included on one slide, or you can spread them out across various slides. Here's where you can also begin to talk about your hypotheses. But generally, with the research questions, same as the purpose statement, you want to make sure that these are written verbatim as what you've already presented in your documents for the same reason. So just making sure we're using consistent language across these areas and there's no confusion as to, what questions are you answering within this presentation and generally within the study. And then, as I said, along with the research questions, you can start to develop your hypotheses. So you should identify whatever hypotheses you intend to test. And this is unique to quantitative studies. So if you are doing a qualitative study, you generally will not have hypotheses in a qualitative study, so you won't need to include them. But if you're doing something that's quantitative or mixed methods in nature, you will want to identify what the hypotheses that will be tested are. And here on the slide, we have some annotation that you can use for the null and alternative hypotheses. So those are just some things to be aware of as well. And just a refresher, that null hypothesis is going to be important later on when you're going to be looking at, rejecting or failing to reject the null hypothesis. So here you'll just want to make sure to really set out some clear parameters for what that is, so that later on, if you are in the final defense phase, it's very easy for your reader or your listener to interpret your findings because they fully understand what that null hypothesis is and kind of what the parameters are for significance in your study. So once you've identified all of that, you can start to talk about the theoretical framework that is going to underpin your study. In doing that, you should name it, identify it, and kind of talk about the background and where you drew connections between this framework and your study. So first, you should really identify what it was developed for and who it was developed by. You might also want to talk about other research that this framework was used in. And then lastly, you'll really draw those connections. So why does it make sense for your study to use the particular framework that you're using? Did you potentially consider other frameworks? And if you did, why did you ultimately choose the one that you selected? So here's where you'll go a little bit more in depth as to, why was this framework collected? Why was this framework decided on? And how does it really connect? So really try to show what features in that framework make sense for the variables that you plan to test, or the concept that you are studying in this dissertation. Next, you are going to get into the meat of your study. So if you're in the proposal phase, this is going to be very important because this is where you are proposing the methods for your study. If you have already passed the proposal phase and you are defending your final research, here's going to be where you are explaining what you did in your study. So kind of just a little switch there between talking about future tense versus past tense. So you'll either be talking about what you intend to do or what you did. Generally, when you get to this slide, you will want to talk both about the proposed method and design. So first, you will identify whether you did a quantitative, qualitative, or mixed method study. And in doing that, you want to make sure that you are aligning that particular method with the problem, purpose, and research questions for your study. And that goes for the research design as well. So you want to make sure that you are looking at those features, so the problem, purpose, and research questions, and letting that drive the selection of the research method or design as opposed to the other way around. So once you've identified what design or what method you're using, excuse me, so you might say something like, I will be conducting a qualitative study. Next, you will want to identify the particular method that you're using. So what method within that qualitative world or that qualitative framework will you be using? We know that in qualitative studies, there are a number of different types of designs that you might use for different things. So for example, you might use a case study, you might use phenomenology, you might use grounded theory, ethnography, whatever design is most appropriate and most aligned with your problem, purpose and research questions, you'll want to identify here. And then you'll want to specify what features of that design align with your study. So if you selected phenomenology, why did you do that? Are you typically with phenomenology, it's because you are looking to understand the way that people make meaning of their experiences, or you're trying to understand those lived experiences. So in those cases, phenomenology may be appropriate. If you are looking to really dive deep into a particular case, by looking at different data collection methods, then you might use a case study. So really just thinking about the features of the particular design that you're using and then identifying where it aligns with your study. And that goes the same for if you're doing quantitative or mixed methods. So if you're doing a quantitative study, using a quantitative method, some designs that you might select are a correlational design, experimental, quasi-experimental. Whatever it is, just draw those parallels to show your reviewers that you really understand the purpose of that type of design and you have thought about how it applies best to your study. So that's what you'll do here on this slide. And some ways that you might bolster that reasoning is by showing alternative studies that you thought of. So again, going with that example of phenomenology, maybe if you selected phenomenology, you considered other studies, and there are a few reasons why you've ruled those other studies out. That's important information that you might share just to really show your reviewers that you've thought about this carefully and you have a good understanding of research methods. That is informing your decisions here throughout this dissertation. Next, you will want to talk about the participants and the sample size. So here it's really important to draw a distinction between the population and the sample. So the population is going to be the larger group that your sample is drawn from, and then the sample is going to be the group of individuals who participate in your study. So for example, if you are interested in doing a study where you are looking at the experiences of women who give birth in the United States, your population is going to be women who gave birth in the United States, and then your sample might be a small subset of that group who you have access to and who participated in your study. So what that might look like is, let's say you're doing a qualitative study, for example, maybe that's 20 women at your local pediatrician's office who you were able to recruit and collect data from. So really make sure you understand the differences between both your population and your sample when you're presenting the slide so that you can clearly communicate them. Here you'll want to provide an estimate for your sample size. So the way that you'll do that, if you are doing a quantitative study, you might do a power analysis. If you're doing a qualitative study, you may look deep into the literature and see what has typically been recommended for your particular research design, or what other researchers have found to yield data saturation. So it may be based on an estimate. So those are some figures that you might present here. And then you also might want to talk about some demographic characteristics related to this population that you plan to study. So if you are studying women who give birth in the United States, or maybe if it's something more specific, like maybe a particular profession like teachers or nurses, whatever it may be, you might want to report some characteristics about that population. So it could be a demographic breakdown, including gender identity, race, age, highest level of education, whatever characteristics you feel are going to be important to your reviewers to know about this population as they review the data that you've analyzed and the results that you've generated. You can include those here. Areas where you might find these type of statistics, you can find them on, for example, the CDC has a lot of demographic breakdowns by different groups, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or maybe any particular websites related to particular professions that have been vetted and are a good source. Those are some areas where you might find those characteristics. But really big takeaways for this slide is you want to identify both that population and sample, and then you want to provide the rationale for your sample size. So if you say that you intend to interview 20 people, well, why 20? Why does 20 make sense? You really want to make sure you are defining that sample size and the reason for it in this slide. Next, you will talk about your data sources and then your collection plans. So here's where you want to get very kind of simple. You want to hold the reader's hand, hold the reviewer's hand, and really walk them through from the moment you get your IRB approval all the way through to when your data is ready to be analyzed. So what is the first step in your data collection procedure? Are you going to maybe reach out to the particular organization from which you intend to recruit participants? So let's say you're doing a study of teachers. Maybe your first step is to send a letter to the school administrators in that school district and to obtain permission to recruit teachers in their campus or teachers in their district. So that might be the first step. Whatever that is, you want to start there and then outline every step in between. So there, there's no amount of too much detail in this section. So you'll start off with that, and then you will talk about the data sources. So if you are doing a quantitative study, maybe you are collecting multiple survey instruments from your participants. So maybe you're collecting like a patient health questionnaire. Maybe you're looking at a scale of depression or a scale of anxiety. Whatever it is for your study, you want to clearly state each of the instruments that are going to be used in data collection. Now, if you are doing a qualitative study, the same goes for you, but it might look a little bit different. So generally in qualitative studies, we're not really going to be using those survey instruments. You might use a demographic survey, but generally the bulk of your data collection is going to be through qualitative interviews or potentially a document review, or maybe even like some participant observations or something like that. So whatever your data source is, you want to identify it clearly, make sure that they understand what this data source is intended to answer. So which research question are you answering with this data source, and also what information do you expect to get from this data source. I find that particularly with qualitative studies, this can be a little bit more difficult. So when you're generating your own interview guide, you might want to really talk about the questions that you have developed for that interview guide and draw some connections between your research questions. So again, if your research question is, what are the experiences of women who give birth in the United States? And maybe in your qualitative interview, you say, where did you give birth? Something like that. Or what was your relationship between yourself and your physician during that process? Just draw some connections to show the reader which research question you're answering with each of those particular interview questions. So once you've identified those instruments, you've identified any permissions that you might need to get in order to begin data collection, you want to talk about your recruitment process. So do you plan on recruiting by, sending out cold emails to participants who you think might be interested? Are you going to post a flyer online, on Facebook, at a local organization? Whatever that process is, go ahead and pop that into this slide here, or, subsequent slides, depending on how much you can fit on a slide, and really identify how participants or potential participants are going to get in contact with you once they have heard about your study. So maybe they have access to your phone number and your email, and they're going to call you to let you know they're interested. And then just to outline the following steps. So after you've got them engaged, will you send them a consent form? Will you send them a link to your survey? Will you schedule a qualitative interview? Just outline that process in a very step-by-step way so that it's easy to follow. Now, up to this point, you would have collected all of your data, and now it's time to analyze it. So again, if you are in the proposal phase, this is where you are going to be proposing your data analysis plan. If you have passed that phase and now you are defending your research, this is where you're going to talk about the analysis that you did. So for both of those, in this step, you will want to talk about any potential data preparation steps that you needed to take before analyzing the data. So for example, if you have survey instruments that you're collecting and there are particular questions that get out your variable of interest. So maybe your variable of interest is depression, and you have 4 questions that ask about depression. And you intend to take like a sum or an average of those questions for the variable depressive symptoms, something like that. Here's where you'll want to talk about those steps that you take to prepare that one variable. So you'll identify what you're doing. So are you taking a sum? Are you taking an average? Whatever that looks like, how are you making sure that you have each of these variables that you've outlined in your research questions clearly ready to be analyzed? So it could be transforming the variable like I've described, or it could be something as simple as just recoding the variable based on what the scale is, or changing it to a binary variable. So really whatever is most appropriate for your study, you'll want to talk about that. And then you'll want to talk about the particular analyses that you're going to do. So once you've transformed all of your variables, they're ready to be plugged into whatever models you're using to analyze the data. And again, this is for a quantitative study, not a qualitative. You'll want to talk about the particular test that you're doing. So it could be that you're going to do an ANOVA or a t-test or a chi-square test of independence. You want to identify that test, explain what it is used for, and then you'll want to talk about any assumptions testing that you need to do in order to do that test. So depending on the test that you're doing, there may be some things that you need to do before you get to that step. So for example, if you're doing a t-test, you want to make sure that you have tested for normality in your sample and also tested for homogeneity of variance. So here's where you might talk about those assumptions testing steps. There are a few different ways to test for each of those assumptions. So you'll just want to outline what you've done. We do have a number of quantitative webinars on our website. So if you're curious or if you're not really sure exactly what assumptions you need to test for your particular analysis, or if you're not sure how to test them, I recommend checking out those webinars because we go a little bit more in depth there, but I'll kind of leave it at that for today for just talking about the presentation. So identify the type of analysis you're going to do and identify any assumptions that you might need to test for that analysis. Now, if you're doing a qualitative study, your analysis is going to look a little bit different because your data is different. So one common technique that I see students using is thematic analysis by Braun and Clark. So whatever the qualitative analysis technique that you intend to use, you just want to identify it, cite it, and explain how it's done. Generally, with qualitative research, you're going to be breaking your data up into codes, categories, and then developing themes based on those codes and categories. So you'll just want to identify what that looks like. With thematic analysis particularly, there are 6 steps that are involved, and they're very well documented within the research. So that's something that you can very easily just kind of, read into your literature search and outline those steps in the presentation. And then in addition to talking about the type of analysis that you're going to do, you will want to talk about the software that you're using. And this goes for both quantitative, qualitative, and also mixed methods. So you can choose to analyze your data by hand if that's appropriate for your study and if that's permitted by your reviewers or your chair or your school. But if you are using a software, you just want to make sure that you let everybody know what software you're using. So whether that's SAS, SPSS, maybe you're using R, NVivo, whatever it is, you'll just want to outline it and cite it so that it's very clear how it's being utilized in your study. Okay, and then if you are in the proposal phase, that will be kind of the end of your presentation. So you're explaining chapters 1 to 3 of your intentions, and then you will summarize all of that, all of those major points before getting approval from your committee to move on to actually collect data. So that's kind of the bulk of your work, just getting through 1 to 3. I would say the meat of that section is really that methods section. So really describing what the process is to recruit and collect data and then analyze it. At this point in the proposal, you might go on to thank your professors, thank your family, thank whoever's helped you through the process, and then just conclude the presentation and then invite everybody to ask questions. I recommend that if you are in the proposal, you have a few slides left over that you're prepared to pull up if any specific questions come up. So maybe slides that explain more in depth the type of analytical method that you're using or the particular test that you intend to study, or even slides that really outline in detail the types of questions that are included in your instruments. It's helpful to just have those on hand just in case you get a question related to those. You can say, oh, that's a great question, and kind of pull up a slide that references them. And that goes for both the proposal and the defense. Anything that you think you might get questioned on or you think could use some further explanation, but you don't want it to eat up too much time in your presentation, I recommend just having some prepared slides at the end of your presentation that you can refer to if you need to. So if you are just proposing, this is where you'll conclude, but I will keep going for those of you who might be actually defending your final dissertation. Okay. So if you are in the final dissertation, after you have talked about your analysis, so you are now explaining what you did to analyze the data, if you're in a qualitative study, some ways that you might guide that particular section are you might show exact quotes or excerpts and show exactly how you coded them and how you developed the themes. So maybe pulling in some of those tables from your manuscript. Those might be helpful in the particular analysis section. Once you've completed that, you will move on to the results. So in the results, again, you would have written your paper already, so you've got these developed, hopefully. You'll just bring them in and really highlight the main points of the results. If you are doing a quantitative study, this can be done by research question. So you'll want to present the results related to each particular research question. And then if you're doing a qualitative study, I would recommend doing it by theme if that makes sense for you. So in that qualitative study, instead of particularly saying, oh, for research question 1, I developed this theme, or research question 2, this one, you might just explain what themes were developed and then talk about how you feel they relate to your particular research questions. So you may present a particular theme. So maybe if we're talking about women's experiences giving birth in the US, maybe that first theme is women experiences challenges with pain management. So maybe your first theme will be presented and then you'll provide some illustrative quotes around that theme and talk about what that really means. Now, in this section for both, I'm sorry, I keep saying both, but I should really say all. So for qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods studies, You want to make sure that you're not doing too much interpretation. Remember that the interpretation is saved for the discussion section. So here you just want to really present kind of the numbers, the facts, the figures, the themes. So what did I find? And then later on, we'll talk about what does it mean and how does it relate to the overall literature. And that brings us to the interpretation of the findings. So once you have said, okay, this is what I found, the next thing you're going to do is talk about what does it really mean. So this is where you're going to bring your content expertise in. So based on the literature that you've already reviewed, based on everything you've read throughout your doctoral program and all of the information that you've collected, what do the findings of your study mean in that context? So here's where you'll talk about whether your findings agree with previous literature or disagree with previous literature, or even if you maybe found something new. So maybe you found a novel finding that hasn't been identified or a variable that has not been associated with your particular outcome of interest in the past. Here's where you'll talk about that. So this is where you kind of really want to think back to that chapter 2. Think about what others have found and where your particular study sits in that field of literature. Then once you do that, you may want to weave in some of your theoretical framework here. So talk about how these findings relate to that theoretical framework, how that framework can be applied, with one caveat here. So if you are doing a grounded theory study, it's possible, well, not, I shouldn't say that. So if you're doing a grounded theory study, you typically don't start with a theoretical framework, you develop your theory. So you wouldn't necessarily need to talk about any theoretical underpinnings. Instead, you might talk about the theory that you have generated in your study. So again, that is for grounded theory if you are using a qualitative method. So once you have interpreted your findings, so you're relating it back to the literature, you are going to begin talking about the limitations of the study. So in these limitations, you can think back to your proposal phase. Now, if you're in the proposal phase, you may have put some thought into this already, but if you're in the full defense, then you really can think back because you've passed that proposal phase. These limitations can be grounded in your findings. They can also be grounded in the particular method or design that you've used for your study. So when I say they can be grounded in the findings, I mean, let's say you found something new, but maybe you feel that you didn't really get to fully understand the new finding. So maybe you did a quantitative study and the 2 variables that you thought were going to have an effect on your main outcome didn't, but you found a 3rd variable that did. That might be an area that future researchers can delve deeper into. So kind of tying these limitations in with the future research. Those are some areas that you might identify as needing further investigation. Now with the limitation, if you want to think back to your research design or your research method, or potentially your data collection, here is where you can again refer back to the literature. So with every single research design, there are a number of limitations that are typically associated with that design. So for example, if you are doing a correlational study, we know that correlation does not equal causation. So that may be a particular limitation that you cite. If you're doing maybe an experimental study, maybe you weren't able to achieve the sample size that you had intended on, and so your findings are not necessarily generalizable to the population or the greater population. So just kind of thinking through what are some potential limitations that I can off the bat identify based on the type of study I've chosen. And then after that, thinking about what are some limitations within the choices that I made. So maybe you developed a qualitative interview guide and you asked a few questions, and maybe you were kind of missing at the end of your study, you realized I'm really missing a main element here, or I'm missing some depth in these questions. Things like that you can identify. I see sample size as a really big one that people talk about. Also, just given the state of kind of some of the more pandemic restrictions that we're seeing, being virtual versus in person, that may be a potential limitation for you, depending on, if you started your dissertation a few years ago or, whatever that looks like. So those are some things that you'll talk about here in the limitations. One thing to note here is that if something is kind of a stumbling block, it's not necessarily a limitation. The limitations are really things that are going to affect the results. So don't think of just inconveniences, but really things that are going to change the results of your study. So let's say you're doing a secondary data analysis, maybe you weren't able to access the data that you wanted to, right? That would be considered a limitation because then you're really having to potentially use different variables, different populations. So those are the types of things that you'll talk about here. And then this slide, I think, should actually go just before the limitations, but it really just depends on who you are. Some people don't like to end their paper on the limitations because they feel that it's ending on a negative note, but it just depends on your template that your school has provided. But generally, I like to talk about the recommendations for practice after the interpretation of the results. So in this section here, you are going to talk about kind of the so what. So you found these things, right, in your results. You believe that they mean X, Y, Z. But now in this piece, you're going to talk about, well, why does it matter and who does it matter to? So if you're doing a study, maybe of nurse practitioners who work in a rural setting or a particular setting, this is where you're going to really get creative and begin to provide some ideas based on your findings around what people in that profession can garner from these results. So what did you identify and why does it make sense to them? How can it help that potential profession? So again, here's where you can get really creative based on your content knowledge and the particular degree that you're studying. And then again, you'll get into those recommendations. So not just recommending things for those particular professions. So not just talking about the population you're studying, but now talking about what additional research can be done on my topic or how can my study be improved upon. So again, you can do this based on your findings. So if you found a novel finding, you might say, future research should really look at that third variable more deeply and try to understand how it's connected to my main outcome. Some other things that you might recommend, you might say that, in my quantitative study, I found that this particular variable is associated with smoking cessation. So maybe you found that those who have social support are more likely to be able to quit smoking. I don't know, maybe something like that. Something that you might recommend is that additional researchers do qualitative research to understand, well, why? What are the experiences that people who are trying to quit smoking have? What are those experiences like, and how does social support impact their efforts to quit smoking? So kind of just thinking creatively here, what other angles of your study can others approach it by and really kind of expand on or modify to come up with maybe a different finding or just a more explained or more in-depth finding. So here I like to think of it as like a Rubik's Cube. Like if you just change one thing in your study, how might that affect this field of research? So kind of just think through here different things that you maybe thought throughout the process that you would change, whether it is that you would recruit a different way or you would use a different instrument or use a different interview guide to collect the data. Just kind of think through those things here. And then to end, you will generally summarize your findings. You'll summarize the presentation, and then you can thank again. So now this is if you're doing the full dissertation, you'll thank your committee members and your reviewers and open it up for questions from your audience. So that is what I'm going to do right now. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. And if you're not able to access the chat, maybe raise your hand just so that we're aware. There we go. Dorothea, do you have a question?
I just wondered about the implication section. It seems as though you combined that with the recommendation. Is that correct?
Yes. So generally they can be two different slides. I like to do them back to back, but it really just depends on the way that your viewers would like the information presented. But generally the implications are going to be talking about the population that you are studying or the population that you're talking about. And then those recommendations for future research are really going to be directed towards like academics, you know, what can you do better to study this particular phenomenon or these variables?
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. If anybody else has questions, go ahead and raise your hand. And if you don't have questions, that's okay too. You'll notice Sierra put some links in the chat to our website and some different free resources on our website. We do offer a free 30-minute consultation. So if you feel like you might benefit from that type of assistance, do feel free to reach out to us. Typically, the way the consultation works is you will talk about your research and we'll identify areas that you might need help, and then we can kind of work from there to see how our specialists can best support you. So I will hang out, but if you don't have any questions, thank you all so much for joining. I hope that we get to see you again, and best of luck as you work on defending your research. So I see we have a question on the findings section. So it says, I'm having difficulty with including too much or perhaps too little. Are you doing a quantitative study or a qualitative study? If you don't mind me asking. Qual. Yep, that makes sense. I know with qual you gather a lot of data, so it can be hard to trim it down. Generally, what I would recommend is when you develop your themes, try to word them in a way that answers the research question. And then if you feel that they aren't directly answering the research question, but are maybe talking about things adjacent to the research question, I would exclude them from your dissertation and maybe save those for future investigation. So really use those research questions to guide what you're sharing. Does that help? Perfect. Yeah, just kind of always bring it back. Like when you're writing your paper, maybe have a sticky note with those research questions and just really make sure, okay, am I answering this or am I just talking about the topic? And that'll help you kind of chop some things out. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining today. These slides will be available and the recording will be available to you after the presentation. So feel free to review them and reach out to us if there's anything else we can help with.